You want me to start?
One sec. It is setting up the live stream. Okay, we're live now. So if you want to go ahead.
Okay. So while the U.S. seems to be consumed with the coronavirus crisis, and now with a week of uprisings that are spreading throughout the country, the United States government is still committed to overthrowing the government of Venezuela, which has been for a number of decades taken a socialist direction. And so I wanted just to report on the last couple of weeks in Venezuela, some important developments, um, and which alert us to the progress that are being made and also the dangers and difficulties. The first thing is that a fourth uh, ocean tanker has docked at the refineries in Venezuela. This is the fourth out of five that have been were sent by Iran to assist with the gasoline shortage in Venezuela. Now, Venezuela sits on a large quantity reserves of oil, but to make that oil usable as either heating oil or especially gasoline, it needs to be refined. And refining requires giant refineries and also chemical additives. And Venezuela had all that or has all that, except because of the years of United States sanctions and blockade against Venezuela, they have not been able to get those additives or the spare parts they need to repair their refineries. So there's a severe shortage of gasoline, which is very taxing. Now, the U.S., United States Pentagon and State Department and President are hoping that people's discomfort with everyday life will lead to an uprising against the socialist oriented government of Maduro, who is continuing the policies of the late, great Chavez. But the fourth tanker arrived, and the U.S. had originally threatened to stop these ships on the high seas, which would have been an act of piracy and war. Uh, but the Iranians said that if that happened, they would stop shipping in the Gulf of Hormuz, which would be a very serious blow. The U.S. has said they'd go to war about that. And also, when the Iranian ships reached the territorial waters of Venezuela, Venezuelan Air Force planes, jets, and also ships went out to meet and escort them in. So it appears for now that we have one more ship to see what happens for now, but it appears the U.S. backed down from their plans to provoke a military crisis on the high seas. This, of course, doesn't alleviate the long-term problems of the blockade and the sanctions, but it was an important development. Now, the second thing is that the United States has announced that they're sending a brigade of special forces to Colombia, next door to Venezuela, under the pretext of stopping drugs. But the FARC guerrilla movement, which is now a political movement in Colombia, stated that they are arriving in June to organize attacks against Venezuela. And by the way, a U.S. brigade numbers anywhere from 1,500 to 3,200 personnel, troops. So, and it was announced by the U.S. that this brigade would stay there for months in Venezuela. And should be noted that Colombian ships, the country of Colombia, their ships and planes have joined the increased U.S. naval presence off the Venezuelan coast. And of course, we all remember that it was only a few weeks ago, May 3rd, that 60 mercenaries, including U.S. former special forces troops, landed with the plan to invade and capture and assassinate President Maduro. They were smashed and most of them captured or killed. So this is another dangerous development. A third development regarding Venezuela was a Delaware federal judge has authorized the sale of Citgo assets. Citgo is a subsidiary of the Venezuelan nationalized and long-term, it's always been long-term national property, their oil company. And that includes the authority for them to go ahead and auction 3 refineries and pipelines that covered 23 states. And this would go to be a big blow. This is seizing the government assets of Venezuela and giving them to other forces. Some of that has been given to the opposition forces, others to people who are making claims against Venezuela. So that's a serious development also, but nothing new. Well, that part's new, but they've been doing this for a while, seizing their assets. A fourth item to take note of is on May 19th, the AT&T company, the US AT&T company, which DirecTV is a subsidiary, pulled out of Venezuela overnight. And they had been the broadcasters of Globovision, which is a privately owned TV station or broadcasting network, but which has a balanced coverage. In other words, not pro-Maduro, but it's not anti-Maduro. Generally, it's in between. And the AT&T caved into State Department pressure, and they cited U.S. sanctions. Take note that the Supreme Court of Venezuela immediately ordered that all the assets of DirecTV be seized. That was 3 days later on May 22nd. And they appointed a board of directors made up of government and other more progressive forces. They also took steps to stop the current board of directors, the one that was running DirecTV. They couldn't leave. Their passports were basically lifted, and all of their personal assets have been seized by the government, or frozen, I should say, by the government. So they're really targeting this, and they're hoping to get what was Globovision back on the air in some short order. And finally, Venezuela has had a very vigorous policies and medical procedures to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. And as our friend Jesus pointed out in a meeting he had with the Moratorium Now Coalition here in Detroit nationally, that almost they've had very few deaths and very few cases. And the cases they had coming in up until, well, he spoke over a week ago, were people leaving other countries coming back to Venezuela. They call them imported COVID cases. And President Maduro announced 82 new cases this past week, but 80 of them had come in from Colombia, people, Venezuelans or others, traveling into Venezuela from Colombia. So that covers the latest events in Venezuela. Thank you.
I had a quick question on one of those things, David. You talked about the Citgo attempt to seize, what is it, refineries?
They've been, the federal judge authorized them to auction them off.
A federal judge in the U.S.?
These are Citgo is in the U.S.
Citgo in the U.S.
has been
owned
seized
by Venezuela.
Yes, it's owned by Venezuela, but now they're going to allow them to be sold off, and the funds going to people who have claims against Venezuela.
Got it. It's crazy.
Are there any other questions? If not, we can move on.
Should we move on?
Yeah.
I had a question on, have you seen the Roots Action thing? It's they're trying to get signatures for supporting an end to the sanctions. No military action without support of Congress. It's a House Resolution 1004. It just came out today. It's something that maybe everybody should consider signing in on.
We'll need to take a look. Who's sponsoring it? My concern is that most of Congress, including the Democrats, almost all of them, some of the most progressive, have all denounced the government of Venezuela. Some of them may oppose intervention, but they all chimed in, Biden especially, with the virulent attacks against the President Maduro and the government. And we should remember that the U.S. has put $15 million bounty on the head of President Maduro and $10 million bounties on the heads of several other leading government officials. And they're bringing charges of drug trafficking against President Maduro's wife. Apparently that's developing also. So this is all part of the slander and attacks against Venezuelan socialist experiment.
Right. I just thought that there apparently are some people in the House who are trying to do this. I don't know exactly who, but it might be worthwhile to support them or send an email support. I can forward it out to anybody who wants.
Austin, did you have the name? What was the name of that bill or whatever resolution?
Let's see, HR 1004. Roots Action is calling for signatures. Let me verify. HR 1004. Yeah, HR 1004, SJ Resolution 11.
Okay. I wanted to look it up, but yeah, I mean, there have been other House resolutions that were sort of supporting the Venezuelan people, but those are supporting, the so-called like rebellion against the Maduro Chavez government. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what this one is.
This one actually calls for an end to the sanctions and no military action. So, I mean, I don't know who's doing it, but it certainly sounds very
I would
pleasant.
be interested to see anything about that. I can't find it.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can check it out, Austin.
I'll forward it to you, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
A Rhode Island Democrat named Cicilline or something like that. I think that is his name. Anyway, it's titled No Unauthorized Military Action. And just the title makes me suspect. It's okay to have authorized military actions. Anyway, we should look into it, make sure it doesn't have slippery words in it like that.
Yeah, the letter that they're asking to be sent is says no sanctions. So it's a little bit better than what I agree, the authorization is, well, I mean, it's better than nothing, but this actually says no sanctions in the letter that Roots Action is pushing out. I don't know if
Okay, I'm at the congress.gov website.
Yeah, Roots Action letter though supports that and also says ended sanctions.
Okay.
Move on. Chris
Okay,
has his hand up.
what else do we have?
Chris has his hand up.
Oh,
Yeah, I just wanted to remind comments that Citgo over the last decade or more has donated thousands and millions actually of gallons of heating oil to poor people, particularly in the Northeast.
Derek has his hand up too.
Yeah, well, Mike basically said what I was going to say. As far as, I would be dead against any declaration of war or sanctions, authorized or not, by the United States. That's it.
Agreed. Okay. Should we move on to the police murders and uprisings? That's the main title of this this talk.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for that report, David. I think people need to put all these various developments. They're all interrelated. We need to put all of them in some perspective because here we have the worst humanitarian and healthcare crisis in over a century in the United States. And at the same time, there's this warmongering that's going on against Venezuela, against the Islamic Republic of Iran, against the People's Republic of China. And people need, we first of all have to be explaining to people that to be making negative statements about Venezuela, about China, about Cuba, Zimbabwe, during this period is really not helpful at all. And I think if we look at both political parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, both of them are attacking China. So I think that should give us an indication that the ruling class and their political organs in this country are united in regard to many aspects of US foreign policy. Even former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders had described President Nicolas Maduro as a vicious tyrant in a debate. So, these are things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking to people who feel very strongly that the root of the current crisis that we're facing right now is the Trump administration. Well, we have to remind people that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, Michael Brown was gunned down in Ferguson, Missouri, right outside of St. Louis, by a white police officer, and who was the president of the United States during that time period. When Trayvon Martin was killed in early 2012 in Sanford, Florida, who was the president of the United States at that time? Tamir Rice, we could talk about this 12-year-old African-American youth who had a toy gun in a park in Cleveland. And somebody called the police and said, it's a kid playing with a gun. It's probably harmless. Well, if it's harmless, why are you calling the police? So the dispatcher, I've heard the tapes, dispatched the police saying there was a black man in the park waving a gun. So 2 white police officers show up, and within 30 seconds, he's been gunned down and he's dead at 12 years old. We could go on and on about these developments. Yesterday, and we could talk about yesterday here in Detroit as well. I joined the demonstrations in the Midtown area where I live, and it was phenomenal. I was following it on Facebook from the police headquarters downtown. And from what I could see from various people who were streaming live, there was a demonstration going down Michigan Avenue. And there was some commotion even at that point. There was some conflict between some demonstrators and a police vehicle. And then apparently something was set off. I don't know what it was, whether the police set it off or whatever. But anyway, people the person who was actually doing the video streaming dove for cover and said he thought he was hit by something. Now, this was in the afternoon. So then I noticed on another live stream that people were marching north on Woodward Avenue. So I said I would go out photograph, video the demonstration, and join it. So it had to be, I don't know, it was hundreds of people that were marching north on Woodward Avenue, and there were demonstrations that was going on and heading in other directions as well, almost simultaneously. And it was very militant. Just about everybody was wearing masks. Most people were social distanced in the demonstration. The police did not try to interfere with it at that stage because there were so many people and it's such a heavily and densely populated area. So the streets, they had the whole street. They proceeded north on Woodward and then went west on West Warren and then south on Cass. And they headed back down to the police headquarters, I believe. I went back home as far down as Temple. So I walked a pretty long distance with them. But people were already dropping off and leaving. Then when I was monitoring it later, people were downtown at the police headquarters. Then there was people heading west on Warren, past 96. And then of course, late, I got information about some arrests that have been made. And of course, the killing of a 19-year-old youth. So we're anxiously awaiting to try to figure out some details about this killing. Some people suspect that it may have been some white vigilante. We don't know at this point, but we're definitely anxious to find out what happened. Because this is at least the second death. There was one in Minneapolis, which nobody's talking about, during the first Wednesday night, I believe it was, where the rebellion really spread widely that night. And there was someone killed on the street. It was speculated that it may have been a shop owner who shot this person to death, but nothing virtually has been said since then. So what I wanted to mainly talk about, and we can open up for a broader discussion on this, is that, as Lenin had mentioned in one of his writings well over 100 years ago, that the historical process oftentimes is uneven. It could go for years, maybe even decades, where it appears as if nothing is fundamentally changing or being transformed, even though it is, even if it's on a level of consciousness. And then all of a sudden, within a very brief period of time, things can change momentously and very rapidly. And if we think about what has happened here in this country and internationally over the last 2.5 months, we are indeed living in a historically transformative period. There's no question about it. And since mid-March, according to the official statistics from the Labor Department, 41 million people have applied for unemployment benefits. And we know more people are unemployed because a lot of people don't qualify for unemployment benefits. People who are undocumented workers, people who have employment that where they're considered personal service contractors, and people who do individual entrepreneurship like vending and other things like that, where they don't pay into the Social Security system. So those people really are not being accounted for in the official statistics. So what we're facing right now is a huge economic downturn. And we don't know how long this is going to last. There's hope on the part of the ruling class, some elements that once the restrictions are lifted, that the economy will be able to improve on a rapid level. But many people are not convinced of that. And we have this pandemic that in cities like Detroit, we've seen a drastic decline in the number of cases daily as well as weekly, but we're not out of the woods yet. Because if people are being forced to go back into the plants, if they have to go back to various forms of employment, there could very well be another peak of COVID-19 cases. And we know the devastating impact it has had on Detroit, New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and so many other cities that have either majority or near majorities or a significant population of African Americans, people of Latin American descent, and other oppressed groups. And the reason that is, of course, is the healthcare crisis that exists in the United States, the lack of preventative healthcare, tens of millions of people who have no health insurance or adequate health insurance. So it makes you extremely vulnerable to opportunistic infections such as COVID-19 and other infectious and other chronic ailments and diseases. So we know that based upon the experience that we've had over the last 2.5 months. So we have a situation now where tens of millions of people are out of work. A lot of people don't have food. They're being threatened with eviction. And of course, they're angry. And a situation that developed in Minneapolis with the brutal execution of George Floyd, it's really not surprising that it set off this type of response nationally and even internationally. And I'll speak about the international aspect later because I think it's important with the elections coming up, and with all this anti-Venezuelan, anti-China propaganda that's being perpetuated by the Trump administration, as well as the Democratic Party. So what we've seen is that in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, people engaging in property destruction, people taking consumer goods, and arson attacks, as well as attacks on the police, to the point where the police have been overrun for the last 3 nights. The mayor, Jacob Frey of Minneapolis, admitted that he gave an evacuation order on Wednesday evening for the 3rd precinct on Lake Avenue in Minneapolis to be abandoned. Because otherwise there could have been a lot of deaths and serious injuries if the police had utilized lethal force in preventing the people from throwing missiles and trying to attack the police station. So the police station was abandoned and it was set alight. Yesterday, which is the 4th day of the rebellion, they went to the 5th precinct, which is about 2 miles from the 3rd precinct. And that, of course, was the focus of the rebellion as well. What we find interesting also is that how rapidly this has spread. Within a matter of days, there have been demonstrations in at least 30 other cities across the United States. Los Angeles, it has gotten extremely intense with people blocking expressways, fires are being set, people are battling the police in the streets. The same thing is happening in Oakland last night. We have reports that 2 federal protective service agents were shot, 1 fatally. We could talk about Chicago. There have been demonstrations there. Atlanta, there have been demonstrations. Last night in Atlanta, people battled the police in the streets in downtown. They attacked the CNN headquarters there, broke windows out of the entrance of the building, and set off several incendiary devices. This was being shown live on CNN last evening. They also torched a police vehicle, and other fires were set as well in the city. This is a southern city that's very conservative, and we had this type of response. New York City, there have been pitched battles over the last 2 days between the police and demonstrators. In Washington, D.C. last night, the White House had to go into a lockdown because of demonstrations out there, which the Secret Service was deployed in an effort to guard the White House. So yes, this is spread rapidly. And yesterday in Detroit, we saw just this mass outpouring with very little advance notice or organizational work. With stuff posted on Facebook, and then it got into the corporate media. They announced it. They said they were going to show it live. They really didn't do a good job of that, and they probably didn't want to, encourage more people to show up. But yes, there were thousands of people that showed up, and there were people who were in vehicles that were blowing their horns, honking their horns. As the demonstration was heading north on Woodward, there were people, merchants, who were handing out bottles of water to the marchers. There were people coming out of their apartments, cheering from the balconies and so forth, encouraging the demonstrators. So it's very, very interesting, very interesting. And today, and I'll make this the conclusion, and then we can open up the discussion. But today, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota held 2 press conferences so far. The first press conference was designed to announce that they were doing a full mobilization of the National Guard in the state of Minnesota to address the rebellion, because they had deployed 1,700 National Guard, according to reports, as well as state police last night, and they retreated. And the streets were taken over by the people. This has happened for the last 4 nights. Tonight, they're claiming they're going to do a full mobilization. So we'll see what happens. Also, they said they had been in contact. This is Tim Walz, the governor, who's a Democrat of Minnesota, said he's been in contact with President Trump, as well as the Secretary of Defense. And Trump had already acknowledged yesterday that they could send in federal troops to help put down the rebellion, which is what happened here in Detroit in 1967. On the first full day of the rebellion, the National Guard was sent in by that afternoon. And by that evening, the situation was such that Mayor Kavanaugh at the time and Governor Romney, who was the father of Mitt Romney, George Romney was his name, who had been the previous CEO for American Motors, had appealed to Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic president, to send in federal troops, that the situation was beyond the capacity of the National Guard, the state police, and the local police to control. So this may happen in the Twin Cities. And it was really amazing to see in St. Paul on Thursday how the rebellion spread there, with over 200 businesses being attacked and numerous arsons that took place there as well. So yeah, I think we're in a very interesting period right now. We've seen periodically rebellions erupt among African Americans, among Latinos in the United States. Well, really going back to slavery, but if you want to talk more about the modern period, since the early 1960s, there was a whole wave of urban rebellions from beginning in 1962 in Florida, small rebellion, but then in 63 in Birmingham, and of course a series of rebellions in 1964 in St. Augustine, Florida, and New York City, and various cities in New Jersey. And then in 65, of course, the Watts Rebellion, which really changed the whole dynamic in the United States in terms of resistance by African Americans. That rebellion lasted nearly a week. It too required the mobilization of the National Guard into Los Angeles. It was a major development. People can go back and read some of the accounts of the 1965 rebellion in Los Angeles, the so-called Watts Rebellion. And then in 66, there was more rebellions. Chicago, the west side of Chicago during the Chicago Freedom Movement. There was the rebellion in Huff in Cleveland during that same year, and I think of over 20 cities. In '67, there were 164 rebellions that erupted that year across the United States. National Guards were deployed in Newark and other cities in New Jersey. In Detroit, we know what happened here. It was the largest urban rebellion up until that time in history. That was led by African Americans, a racial rebellion. So yes, are we on the eve of another wave of these type of rebellions and mass demonstrations? We very well could be. It may be too early to tell right now because periodically we've seen these outbreaks, but it could be, considering the economic crisis that we're facing, combined with the intensification of racial oppression and exploitation in this country. And it was also encouraging to see so many allies, European Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, Asian Americans, who were out there in the streets yesterday in Detroit, who have been out there all this week across the country. So what we're looking at is the outline of a people's uprising in the United States. Because we know at this point, we don't have the organization, we don't have the coordination to take this to its logical conclusion. We didn't have it in the 60s. We haven't had it. There were efforts made to develop that capacity through groups such as the Black Panther Party and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, the Republic of New Africa, and others. In 1980 in Miami, when there was a huge rebellion there was not the organizational capacity to take it to its logical conclusion. The Rodney King rebellions in the early 90s, it was the same situation. And we saw what happened in Ferguson. People in Ferguson fought valiantly for well over a year. They were demonstrating almost every day. So in Baltimore in 2015, there was a rebellion. But we know that if we look at the history of Russia, of China, of Iran, of Zimbabwe, of South Africa, of Ghana, Angola, Mozambique, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, it takes a revolutionary movement, an organization, or a political party to effectively battle the forces of oppression and exploitation. And this is what is needed right now in this country. I don't see things getting any better anytime soon with this massive pandemic, with the healthcare system in crisis, with the educational system in crisis, with tens of millions of people out of work, and the policies that are being advocated by both dominant political parties have no relationship to any type of socialist orientation or non-capitalist path of development, if you will. They're talking about the same things that have failed, that have gotten us to this point in 2020. So Lenin, in his essay entitled Marxism and Insurrection, it was written in September of 1917, just a month or so prior to the seizure of power by the Bolshevik Party. He talks about the necessity of seizing state power. And this is the only way in which these issues can be addressed on a level that is required during this period. We need a guaranteed annual income. We need national health insurance. There needs to be a fundamental right to housing in the United States. There needs to be attention paid to environmental degradation, to racism, to gender oppression and exploitation. All of these things need to be addressed in this period. And we have to continue to build And we have to continue to intervene in these popular struggles that are erupting across the United States, whether they be community-based, whether they be in labor. We've seen tremendous trepidation on the part of labor about what's happening. Thousands of their people have gotten sick over the last 2.5 months, have died. We've seen bus drivers here in the city die. Fred Westbrook, who was the former president of the ATU 26, who we had worked with during the emergency management and bankruptcy. They were a militant union. They opposed the plan of adjustment. They told their members to vote against it. Fred Westbrook has had his life taken by COVID-19. And there are others. Isaac Robinson, who was a Democratic state representative, but we have been working with him recently around the literacy case. He had hosted a town hall meeting a few months ago, which Jerry and I attended. Jerry spoke there. So this crisis is real, and we have to continue to meet. We have to continue to plan. We have to continue to organize to protect ourselves, but also to intervene in these struggles, which seem to be inevitable. And it's an international crisis. And finally, I just want to say, what has happened over the last week illustrates that we have the potential to build international solidarity. We saw this in the 1960s in terms of Black revolutionaries being given asylum in Cuba, in China, in Tanzania, in Algeria, and so forth. Just over the last few days, the chairperson of the United Nations Commission for Human Rights, who's from Chile, Michelle Bachelet, she's the former president there, issued a statement condemning the killing of George Floyd, and also condemning the whole legacy of police violence against African Americans. Now, this is something that Malcolm X had raised over 55 years ago, that the African American struggle needs to be internationalized, that the African American people need to appeal to the United Nations, not that they can solve the problem, but it places the issue in an international arena. Also this week, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, which represents 55 independent, well, 54 independent African states, as well as the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, which is still colonized by Morocco in North Africa, but they still have a seat at the African Union. Musa Faki this week issued a statement. Africa has 1.2 billion people. This is a powerful gesture of solidarity to their, as Malcolm X described, long lost sisters and brothers in North America. They issued a statement condemning the police killing of Mr. Floyd. And they condemned racism against the Black citizens of the United States. And they did it on the basis of a resolution that was passed in July of 1964 at the second OAU Summit, which is the predecessor to the African Union. It was called the Organization of African Unity. It was formed in 1963. It was composed of independent African states in an effort to build unity and also to assist other territories that were fighting against colonialism and imperialism in the 1960s and 70s. They gave a lot of assistance to groups like the African National Congress, to the Southwest Africa People's Organization, to Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front, to the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, to the Zimbabwe African National Union of Zimbabwe. They gave a lot of aid through the OAU Liberation Committee to provide educational resources, to provide guns, military training to the revolutionary fighters that were fighting against colonialism in Africa during the 60s, 70s, and all the way up until the 1890s and even 1990s and even the 1990s, because South Africa was not gained its freedom until 1994, which is 26 years ago. It was a resolution passed in 1964 at the OAU summit, and it was a direct result of the intervention of Malcolm X. He went to the summit in July of 1964 on behalf of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And he appealed to the African heads of state, to the liberation movements. There were people like Amilcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau, who was the founder of the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, the PAIGC, which still exists today in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. And there were other liberation movement fighters there in Egypt in July of 1964 at the OAU summit. And as a result of his appeal, he submitted an 8-page memo to all the heads of state, to all the liberation movements in 1964, appealing for their endorsement to raise the question of the oppression of the African-American people, not only at the OAU, but also in front of the United Nations. And as a result of that, a resolution was passed in support of the struggle of the African-American people. This was in 1964, in July. We know Malcolm X was killed about 7 months later, after that happened. They utilized that same resolution from 1964 to issue the statement that the African Union made on behalf of the African-American people just on yesterday. So it shows that the work that Malcolm X did, the work of the revolutionaries of previous generations and decades can bear fruit. And we have to learn from those lessons. And we're going to continue to raise these questions until we get, full freedom and full self-determination and social liberation. So I can end there and we can open up. People have things to talk about or other reports or whatever. Thank you.
That was excellent, Abiyomi.
Thank you.
I'll just say that.
Awesome.
Well, in terms of yesterday, people were talking about the speakers. I was watching it on Facebook before I got involved, before it came into the area. And I noticed Joanna Underwood spoke, and there was the president pro tem of the city council, Mary Sheffield, Willie Burton, who's on the board of police commissioners, spoke about facial recognition technology, and there were others as well. But I think it was good we were there, to participate. Miko, who appeared to be one of the key organizers, acknowledged Moratorium Now and their support in his Facebook live stream after the rally was over. So it looked like it was different parts of the action. It was multifaceted, and it's just a tragedy that someone was killed last night downtown, and we really need to find out what happened.
Well, thanks. I guess people are probably going to want to ask questions and make comments now. Already Austin has his hand raised, so maybe you want to go, Austin. You're muted right now, by the way, Austin.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. Yeah, I just looked on US News, Detroit demonstration, and it looks like they say that 60 people were arrested. Most of them were from the suburbs. Who are those people from the suburbs?
I don't know. It was a lot of people there yesterday that I didn't recognize. Now there are a lot of African Americans that live in the suburbs, in Southfield, Lathrop Village, Oak Park, Farmington Hills, Livonia, Taylor, Warren. So I don't know who they are. What's interesting about that is that today, Governor Walz was talking about how 80% of the people that were arrested in Minneapolis were from outside the city. So the journalists asked, well, who are these people? We want their names, so we can verify what you're saying. They said they would get them later. So we'll see. I know the chief of police said that people from outside should not come into the city. They should protest where they are. But the problem with that is we have people like Dan Gilbert, the Illages, the Penskes. I don't believe most of them live in the city. And they do business here to get tax breaks here. So if people want to come into Detroit to participate in political activity that are organized by people in Detroit, we had a year ago, the Nazis got an armed escort through downtown. I don't think they lived in the city. And they covered it up for 2 days. It was only the international media that exposed it to the extent that the local media had to cover it. They were going to cover it up completely. That they had this SS action group or whatever they were called came into the city during the Pride Festival, Motor City Pride Festival, and agitated people, used racial slurs and all types of insults against people, and marched through sections of downtown with a Detroit police escort. So, we have to analyze these things. During the civil rights movement in the South, I used to live in the South as a young person. My parents were involved in the civil rights movement. There were a lot of students who came from northern universities to assist the African Americans who were fighting to desegregate schools, public places, to win the right to vote and so forth. And they were labeled as outsider agitators. So don't be surprised when we hear this. Also, the question of Russia. This was brought up too today during the press conference in Minnesota, saying that Russia was deliberately stoking conflict in the United States. I don't believe it was the Russians that killed George Floyd. It wasn't the Russians that killed Breonna Taylor. I don't think it was the Russians that killed Ahmaud Arbery. If anybody can tell me otherwise, I'd really like to hear that, that it's the Russians that are behind the rebellions. In the 60s, they were saying it was China was behind the urban rebellions. Mao Zedong was, behind the rebellions in Detroit and other places. Because Robert Williams, who was a revolutionary that was forced into exile, had been in Cuba, and he had a radio show called Radio Free Dixie that broadcast over shortwave, and you could pick it up in areas of the South, and even on shortwave radio in other parts of the country. And he was broadcasting from Cuba, and then when he was in China, he still published a newsletter which was brought into the United States. So this is an old line on the part of the ruling class that the oppressed cannot rise up and have rebellion. And I don't think they've seen anything yet. I really don't. In terms of the pent-up anger and frustration that people feel in this country right now.
Thank you. I think really well said. And I see we've got 3 people with their hands up, and I was just thinking that maybe if any of you wanted to directly respond to Austin's original question, because everybody raised their hand right then, they should probably go ahead before we move on to the next. So Sharon, then Mike, then David, but does anyone want to reply to Austin? Oops, I had Sharon was muted. Hey, Sharon, go ahead.
Well, Abiomi, first, I want to thank you for such an amazing talk. I always appreciate you bringing forth what you know and your thoughts. What I would like to say is I was watching MSNBC the first night of the riots, and a councilwoman came on from Minneapolis and said that she had seen George Floyd in the streets sometimes. And then she said that the police officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck worked with George Floyd as a bouncer
Yeah.
and they'd known each other for 14 years. And to me, no one has talked about that at all. And my guess was that George Floyd knew something about this policeman, and he wanted to kill him, so he couldn't tell. But that's beside the point. I just wanted to hear what your thoughts might be about that.
Well, yeah, this is important. Yesterday, they interviewed this woman who owned a business where both Chauvin and Floyd worked doing security.
Yeah.
She said she wasn't clear whether they knew each other, but in all likelihood they did. I mean, if you work in an establishment like a club as security, I mean, at some point you have to all come together to figure out what your workloads are and other issues. I mean, the staff has events, dinners or parties or whatever that the public are not even invited to. So, we have to find out more about what's really going on, because yes, if they had that connection, work-related connection, it's highly probable that this cop knew Floyd. I mean, it's, and the woman mentioned that he had a fear and a hatred for Black people. Derek Chauvin. This is what the woman who owned the business, who's Latina. So yes, could very well be the case. It could very well be the case that they knew each other.
Thank you.
Mike, you've got your hand up next.
Yeah, just I wanted to address something else, but I want to talk about the restaurant owner, the club owner. I think she added a couple other things, that George Floyd was very gentle with the customers, and that cop was the opposite. He'd sometimes go off on people and a tendency to use pepper gas on clients of the club. So he clearly exhibited behavior that you don't want to see in anybody that interacts with the public. That being said, I want to address this whole thing of outside agitators. It's almost like on cue, police departments around the country, beginning yesterday, started talking about the outside agitators. There's several reasons for this, I think. The ruling class is in fear of the multiracial, multinational presence of young people all around the United States. And we know that many of us live in segregated neighborhoods. So for us to come to the aid of groups of other nationalities who are facing repression from this government means we're going to come in from outside of those communities. That's what mutual aid is about. That's what solidarity is about. Martin Luther King used to be accused of being an outside agitator all the time.
Yes.
I mean, Abiyumi referenced this indirectly, but he was accused of being an outside agitator. We need outside agitators. Outside agitators on a world scale is what allows revolutions, what allowed the anti-colonial movements to succeed. We cannot fight the oppressor with only the limited resources that we have in our own communities. We're fighting the oppressor in part because we have limited resources in our communities. That's the nature of the society we live in the United States. So I think we need to be wary of these accusations of outside agitators. What I saw yesterday, the pictures and stuff, clearly there are a lot of people mobilized. You know, we've been around for a long time. You start to recognize the usual suspects, the activists that are always downtown doing things for the people. What I saw were new people. And the cops know the same things we do. They probably picked on the new people on purpose, knowing, well, that's how you scare a new activist, is you hammer them on their first experience or first demonstration. But you also have a good chance of then building a narrative that it's all outside people. Anyway, I think we just need to be wary of this. On an international scale, Venezuela needs outside support. China needs outside. You know, we need to go global and tell them, damn right, we're outside agitators. We're one big global community, and we're going to fight this together. Anyway, that's how I feel about it. I was alarmed at how rapidly this dialogue was picked up by police departments all over the U.S. yesterday. That's all.
Yeah, these are talking points that they're deploying at this stage. Today, they trotted out, you know, a lot of black and brown elected officials, ministers, etc., to decry the fact that there had been so much property damage and arson and so much antagonism towards the police in Minneapolis and St. Paul. To say that the legitimate leaders are the politicians and others. And we take nothing, we work, you know, with progressive politicians. We're willing to work with them. We're flexible in that regard. But many of them cannot speak to the actual conditions of the masses because many of them are beholden to the Democratic Party. And their main objective right now is to get Joe Biden elected as president in November. You know, there are secret ballots in the United States. You go into a booth, or either you get an absentee ballot and you vote. Nobody's supposed to be standing over your back looking at who you vote for. It's a personal decision, even though it's political. But at the same time, we know that voting is not going to solve this problem. We had an African-American mayor for 20 years who was one of the most progressive in the country. But there were still contradictions that existed in the city of Detroit. We've had 3 other African-American mayors since then, you know, prior to the imposition of the mayor that was imposed in 2013. But if you look at Atlanta, St. Paul, Minnesota, Washington, D.C., they all have African-American mayors. Even Denver, I believe, and Montgomery, Alabama, and so forth, which is good. We support that. We uphold the right of people to vote because we know historically African-Americans have been denied the right to vote. Even after the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. You know, I've talked about this a lot over the years. It took another 95 years to get a Voting Rights Act passed, even though in 1870 they had already passed an amendment to the Constitution that ostensibly guaranteed all, quote, men, unquote, the right to vote, because women didn't get the right to vote until 50 years later. But in the South, African-American women or men didn't have the right to vote in most areas. Some areas they did, a few they would allow to vote, but in most areas, you know, we had high concentrations of African-Americans like in Alabama and Georgia, even in Tennessee, people were not allowed to register to vote. They had poll taxes. If that didn't work, they would just terrorize you to the point where you didn't want to vote or, you know, drove you out of town or whatever. So this has been going on in the United States for the last 155 years. So this is a very, very serious problem, and it's not going to be resolved by merely going to the polls. We got to have organization, we got to have mobilizations, and we got to have political education. What are we voting for? What are our policy aims and objectives? What is our political program? In Detroit, we've been talking about this for a number of years. We need guarantees for the right to water, housing, utilities, quality education, environmental justice. All of these things cannot necessarily be given to you at the ballot box once every 4 years, or once every 2 years, or once every 6 years. And if we listen to the rhetoric of most of these politicians, it's quite similar. They all attack China. They don't say anything about we need full employment. We need a guaranteed annual income. We need to end wars of aggression. They all talk about how they need to strengthen the U.S. Defense Department. So yeah, we need a revolutionary program. That's what's needed. And we have to keep raising this in this period. Because people like Tim Waltz and others are going to be coming into the communities. They're going to be offering people jobs, grants from private foundations and so forth, to set up programs to direct people's attention away from the underlying issues that bring about these rebellions that are taking place across the United States.
David, you had your hand up for a little while.
Yeah, I have a number of points I want to make. Let me start with the famous outside agitators. So Chief Craig better look at his own ranks.
Right.
The outside agitated, the white cops living in the suburbs who occupy many of Detroit's neighborhoods. What are they doing there?
Right.
I mentioned earlier, but not everybody was on. We provided the sound system, but we had no political influence over the demonstration as a whole. We were just not numerous enough or organized enough to do that. And the turnout surprised everyone. But there were two general lines that came across from the speakers. I mean, there were quite a few speakers who spoke very well in terms of anti-racism, anti-police brutality, the history of African-American oppression. So that was, of course, there. But there were other speakers who focused that the solution to everything was to get Trump out of office, the elections coming up. And then there were others, Underwood and some others, who focused on that it's not just violence, police violence and murder, it's the violence of the banks and corporations in shutting off water, thousands, tens of thousands of people without water still today. And the 2,000 evictions that are going to come up in a matter of weeks if the moratorim's not extended. So, you know, that was a kind of a violence that they addressed, and that was good to hear. That was coming. It wasn't from our speakers, but because we were not able to field speakers. But it was good to see that this was our program for the last 20 years, and some of these folks that we've worked with picked that up. It was clear that the whole event in Detroit lacked any organization. Miko, we've known for a long time. It's kind of a loner in a lot of respects. He had worked, I think, with Underwood and a couple other people, putting out the call on Facebook. They brought a platform to speak from. We brought the sound system, and they brought some water and masks. Almost all the signs came from individual homemade signs, which is fine, but programmatically, you know we've been able to intervene on occasion big demonstrations with a good banner or some signs. I did make up 4 or 5 signs and brought them, and they were gobbled up real quickly, at least to get our name out there. So that's not a criticism. It's just that if we're able to, in situations like that in the past, we've been able to control. Even Miko couldn't control the speakers who spoke, or wasn't intent upon doing that. And in the past, we've been able to have chairs. We've been able to have some good spokespersons for the press. You know, we knew how to do it. We just weren't numerous enough there to play that role, even though we brought the sound system. These points I'm raising aren't in any special order. Abiyumi spoke extensively about the rebellions in the 60s. And we should remember that out of those rebellions, not directly, but indirectly, came organization. And I'm thinking of the American Indian movement, the Young Lords. You mentioned, of course, the Black Panthers, and many others, local and national organizations. And that very well could occur now. And they were revolutionary, and some had more Marxist programs like the Panthers. Others perhaps not so much, but they were definitely an important step forward. A lot of us hoped that the Marxist organizations and the national liberation organizations that existed back then could have fused into a federated party of some kind. But also remember, back then was a period where Marxism was at a height. All the national liberation movements were talking about Marxism, and so it's not necessarily identical now, but we should expect there may be organizations. But there's also an awareness of the ruling class to put those organizations into a path into the ditch with the nonprofits. We saw Black Lives Matter expand and then disappear as a number of the leadership were co-opted. Joyce was pointing out, and I agree with her, that the rebellion is really a rebellion against the COVID pandemic and the things that it's exposed in this capitalist system. Sure, Floyd's death triggered it, but people for over 2 months now, I saw a figure where workers under $40,000 a year, which is barely, survival mode, that 40% of them have lost their jobs, 40% unemployment. So when they say, well, it's unemployment of 20% or 20 million, whatever the numbers, it's much greater than that among a lot of the working class. And people are having trouble feeding their families. So it's a broad social problem exposed by the COVID virus and provoked by the Floyd killing. I did see something else I saw was the preliminary autopsy. They're already getting ready to let this guy go. Preliminary autopsy, he was not killed by strangulation. He had contributing factors. I could just smell it, right? So look at it, TV, and,
Yes.
and they're saying that on CNN. So yeah, just because he was arrested on what the hell is third-degree murder anyway? But even if that's the case, it's a long way to conviction. And failure to convict may produce even bigger rebellions. Folks may or may not remember Los Angeles, was that 92?
Yes.
92. They moved in troops and 11,000 people were arrested. 11,000 protesters were arrested and held. So yeah, we may see quite a bit more coming up. But in addition to COVID exposing what capitalism has to offer, the other thing is that, and we've been talking about this since 1972, the standard of living has decreased in the United States, more or less. Sometimes it's leveled out, but it's decreased. And we've said that over and over again, that the economics will elicit find a political expression. And this is part of that political expression. We should, I don't want to spend time on it, we should take note of how this is viewed from abroad. While politicians here might be decrying violence and looting, I'm sure the people of Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, People's Korea, China, and other places are breathing a sigh of relief, perhaps, that some kind of rebellions are breaking out in the US, exposing the false narratives that have been put forward. So these are just some of my thoughts. We need to increase and find a way to intervene more. I know, Derek, you said you got there. Abiyumi participated when it came near his house, and Jackson and I participated. And we did what we could, but you know, we'll try to do more in the future. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say.
Thanks. I wanted to raise my hand as well. I can't because I'm the host, but I'm just going to say a few ideas. I have a few different thoughts as to, you know, strategizing. What do we think that a good way would be to contribute our ideas to a program, or to join up maybe with a developing program to sort of push something like this into a certain direction? Another question I have is what would be a way to prolong the protest activity? I just got word from a friend of mine who was there. I couldn't be there, unfortunately, but a friend of mine who was there and witnessed police violence, actually suffered some police violence, but there's another demonstration beginning, like imminently, apparently. People are going out. And that's hearing from some people that were right next to some of the more like heated skirmish areas. What's a way for this to be able to develop and sort of smolder for long enough for a program to eventually develop? Because if it doesn't continue night after night after night, from my view, that won't be able to happen. You know, and we see some place like France, for example, where the Yellow Vest movement was in the street for so long, there's more of an opportunity for a program to develop. And then a last thought that I had, maybe in a different part of strategizing would be, if we're talking about sort of a plurality of voices speaking out up in front of a protest movement, sort of a mishmash of ideas that are being put forward, sort of resulting in kind of an eclectic sense from the participants of what is really going on here. What would be a way, or is there a way to start to sort of eliminate that mishmash, or that eclectic mix of differing ideas, to sort of pull the movement in different directions? Because I've been a part of plenty of different ongoing night after night struggles, including Occupy, where there were just so many different ideas and voices being thrown around that just failed to feel cohesive. Is there a way to address that problem? Because I see it as something that can really derail a movement. And I think that's just a general question to everyone of just food for thought.
Well, does anyone want to address that? Yeah, I think it's inevitable at this point. You know, in terms of what has happened just over the last four or 5 days, yeah, it's going to take time for the movement to find itself, if it can be sustainable. You know, they're thinking strongly and tactically as well as strategically, I mean the ruling class, on how to squash this. But they have some problems in doing it. And one is, of course, the economic crisis, which could bring in, you know, broader layers of people into this struggle. And the healthcare crisis and the education crisis. So, but we'll have to see how it develops. I think it's, it's going to take some time to actually see how things are going to develop. I mean, if we look, we always talk about, various struggles that have taken place historically. You mentioned the Occupy movement. We had Occupy Detroit here, and we were instrumental in jumpstarting that. It was a great effort. There was greater emphasis on the whole struggle around housing that came out of it, as well as environmental justice. But as you said, it did not have the ability to solidify into a unified movement or even a united front, for that matter, to last. It's been 9 years, almost 9 years now since it developed. So, but it's not just here. The Occupy movement was heavily influenced by the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt earlier that year, which were uprisings against the neo-colonial regimes that were backed by the United States. And Tunisia, of course, was backed heavily by France. And the masses rose up. They forced, the two leaders to abandon state power, but they were not in a position to see state power themselves in the interests of the people, the majority of the people in those societies. So this is what I was talking about when I described, how this rebellion that we're seeing now, in many ways, was inevitable. Human beings will rise up. They will resist. They will fight against oppression. They may tolerate it for years. They can act like they don't even see people being beaten and killed by the police. And then all of a sudden, somebody is killed. And we see what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 days. But whether or not this can be sustained, we have to see. It's going to take organization. It's going to take political education. It's going to take coordination. And it's going to really be a challenge now, considering, a lot of people are being denied resources, fundamental resources. But the dynamics are very interesting, because if we're going to have people being thrown out of their homes, and if people are going to be in a situation where they can't purchase food, and the food banks they're incapable. They can't feed 41 million families or households in the United States. It's impossible. So, the government is going to have to do something. Otherwise, they're going to have a horrendous situation on their hands. Even if it's not organized, it could still be very destructive to the state and the ruling class in this country. If they impose martial law, for example, the governor today, Walz of Minnesota, suggests, it seems, if you listen to his speech, it's like he's calling for the declaration of martial law in the Twin Cities by doing a full mobilization of the National Guard. Trump said, yeah, we can send in federal troops. So they could do that. They could send troops in to occupy the cities and the suburbs. But how long will that bring about peace? They've already trying to, foment a fascist movement. That's what Trump represents. But fascism, in Germany and in Italy led to World War, because they had to go outside their national boundaries to conquer, literally enslave and exploit and expropriate the resources of other people. It failed, but they killed 50 million people between, if we want to look at if we want to look when Hitler came in 1933, or Mussolini in 1922 who was the original fascist leader. But, we have some profound challenges that we're dealing with at this point. But I cannot say with honesty, and other people can comment on this, how this is going to develop. We have an unprecedented economic crisis. We have an unprecedented since the 1930s up to the point of World War II. And we have a health crisis that I believe, and other people have said this too, has not been such a crisis since the influenza pandemic between 1918 and 1920. That's been over a century ago. So yeah, these are some variables that could really be very explosive during this period. But how it's gonna come out, it remains to be seen. But it was very interesting that you know, all those National Guardsmen and state troopers they sent in last night, they still had to pull back. Because let's say if they killed 10 people in Minneapolis tonight, the National Guard and the police, how are people going to react to that in Minneapolis and around the country? So I'm sure they're very, very much concerned about this. This is an election year. There's an economic crisis. If millions of people start going into the streets, defying the public safety authority, and they have to impose martial law, it could be a very, very volatile situation. But you know, we have to really monitor what's happening. But it's unfolding pretty rapidly. Now it could burn itself out. We saw that 5-6 years ago. But then, you know, it may not. It may have more sustainability, and we have to be prepared to deal with that.
Yeah, thank you. Austin, you had your hand up next, and then David.
Yeah, I had just a couple quick questions. One is the U.S. News World Report mentioned nothing about numbers other than police confronted dozens of protesters. Are we talking hundreds really, or thousands, or what would you say? And how many police were there? What would you guess?
I was at the police headquarters only, and that filled a huge parking lot and a grassy area. I don't know if you know the old casino there. My estimate was at least 1,000 people there, a real 1,000. And then they marched off in two different directions, two groups. So I don't know, people were still arriving when I went home. So yeah, but it was definitely not just dozens or hundreds. It may have been 1,000 or more.
And one other question, the Floyd fellow, they mentioned that the police were arresting him or something for fraud or something. What was that about?
From what they reported, they claimed he had given a counterfeit $20 bill to somebody in a store. You know, what's the big deal? Okay, now, how do you know he was the person that passed the $20 bill? Was it actually counterfeit? You know, these are, and even if it was true, I mean, they could give him a summons to show up in court, or they could have just taken him in. And why should somebody be killed over a fake $20 bill? You know, it's just absurd to hear this kind of stuff being said. And as David mentioned about this initial autopsy report, which is very rapid. Usually it takes time to do a thorough autopsy and toxicology. Well, they can do the autopsy, but there's a toxicology report that usually comes, but it takes a longer period of time. They've already decided that he was hypertensive, that he had cardiovascular disease, and he had some type of intoxicant in his bloodstream. So that was why he died, not that somebody had put their knee on his neck for over 8 minutes. The same thing with Malice Green in 1992. He was an African-American, 35 years old, in Southwest Detroit. He was confronted by some police. He was beaten to death with flashlights. It was a horrendous act. This was just 6 months after the Rodney King rebellions, and they were concerned about a rebellion happening here in Detroit. So Coleman Young, that was his last year in office. He immediately fired the 2 officers involved, was 4 of them actually, the 2 who were criminally charged, who actually carried out the beatings, Butson and Nevers, one of whom had been with Stress, the decoy unit in the early 70s that had killed like 33 people in Detroit. And he had actually been involved in the killing of someone during that time period. But yes, they were convicted of second-degree murder in 1993 in Recorder's Court, which was a city court that had existed at least since the Civil War, since 1865, at the end of the Civil War, at least. It may have existed before that. But they abolished Recorder's Court after that, under John England. The state legislature abolished Recorder's Court. They also abolished the residency requirements for police officers and other city municipal employees. So that's why you have people from northern Michigan and western Michigan who can come and be police officers in Detroit without even living here. So, and this occurs in other cities as well. So they abolished Recorder's Court because you had a majority African-American city with a jury that was majority African-American that convicted 2 white police officers for killing an African-American. Now they said this was the first time this has ever happened in the history of the United States, that 2 white cops were convicted of murder of an African-American. There have been cases where they've been convicted of other crimes where the person died, but for second-degree murder, it's very rare. We saw what happened in Baltimore, the cops that were responsible for Freddie Gray's death. Carolyn Mosley, who's the prosecutor there, African-American woman, immediately filed charges which helped quell the situation in Baltimore 5 years ago. And the case was undermined from within the system. It just collapsed. So the police were not convicted in his murder. And they're setting up the same situation now in terms of Mr. Floyd, to say that, oh, he had other health problems and that's why he died. Well, that's absurd, because if somebody had a health problem, that's even more reason not to assault them on the street, because they could die. But he didn't die because he may have had high blood pressure at that. He wouldn't have died at that moment. He wouldn't have died because, they claim, who knows what he had, he had been drinking or whatever, he wouldn't have died from that. He died because of a racist white system exemplified by this police officer who decided that he had to carry out this murderous act. And he knew what he was doing. People told him to stop. He was being videotaped and he continued to do what he was doing. There's no way you can put your neck forcefully on someone else's, put your knee forcefully on somebody else's neck for that length of time without knowing the distress that that person is experiencing and that that person is dying. So this is a cold-blooded act that took place, and I think the people who have come out in the streets demonstrating are justified in doing that. Because if it hadn't have happened, it would have been even a greater tragedy for people not to respond to this. I've heard people say that they're glad this is happening, because the system needs to know that we're still human beings and we can respond to this type of oppression and brutality on a mass level.
David, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just in response to your inquiry, Jason,
Huh?
it's not our job to, well, we didn't start the rebellions. The system caused it. Uh, I'm not sure that we have to concern ourselves with making sure they continue or the struggle continues to the best of our ability, maybe, but it'll have its own dynamic. But uprisings against oppression, Abiyumi said, will happen. Uh, and they'll have their own dynamic. You'll have a strike that goes along for a certain while and either wins, loses, or peters out. You'll have an uprising. Occupy had a certain dynamic. We helped it along. We made sure we would do what we can, but it's almost inevitable that this, as in other previous uprisings and movements, will peter out without a revolutionary organization and program. And Marxists have known this a long time. Lenin wrote about it. And what our job would be is to try to bring the best and the best fighters and the most militant fighters and thoughtful fighters together so that we can participate even more forcefully in the next uprisings or protests or whatever, and ultimately lead, when it's possible, lead to some kind of a overturn of the state power. And we've known how to do this a long time. It's a little difficult with being locked up mostly, but just to give an example, in Occupy, we spent weeks going to Occupy. We moved our weekly moratorium meetings. We brought chairs, set them up on the corner so we would attract, not in an obtrusive way, but we attracted people to come to our meetings to hear a political discussion. So we brought program and organization to that. In other cases, we made signs that may express not elect Biden or something like that, but more revolutionary signs. To rebel is justified. I think we had with Ferguson, from Ferguson to Detroit, rebellion is justified. Youth need jobs, housing, education, etc. We brought programmatic demands. On the other side, when we had possibility of speakers, we defended the uprisings. And that's our job now too, to defend uprisings. The right to rebel is justified. And to counteract the moderates and the counter-revolutionaries who are talking about violence, this isn't the way. And our good friend Miko, constantly, including today all day online on his Facebook postings, has separated himself from violence. Well, we don't need to encourage the violence. We're not going to say, yes, burn, loot, etc. But we can say that this is a justified response to an outrageous system and outrageous racism and murder. I was watching on TV this morning, Trevor Noah, usually a comedian, and he was doing that. He never condemned it. He said, what if people didn't rebel? Ask that question, that this would go on. And he had quite a thoughtful way, in his own way of expressing it. And then I saw Andrew Young, who denounced this and it's defacing Dr. King's legacy. It's all non-revolutionary, and we need to tell people not to encourage them to burn and loot, but to defend when that does happen, to defend it and say the killings are what we should be outraged about. The response is inevitable, and but what we have to do out of each struggle that emerges is try to bring 1, 2, 10, 100 people into the organization, into the revolutionary organization or organizations, the best we can. And we've had success over the years. I mean, the one person out of all of Occupy who really took note of our programmatic approach, because we didn't just have those meetings, but we proposed things. We helped them meet with the labor movement. We brought the biggest demonstration of support from the labor movement into Occupy, aside from also getting their bathrooms and other things for them organizationally. But we programmed, was Tom Michalak, who realized, he heard Mike Shane speak and he said, that's pretty good. And then he heard Abayumi at a different meeting speak. And he said, something's going on here. These guys, and then he saw that they were together after the meeting, and he realized, and what he was looking for was a revolutionary communist organization. And that's our job. We have a big problem. You know, the disintegration of the left in this country, even the best of the left. We've been witnessing that for a few years now. Our own roots have been shattered. We temporarily had a great influx of young people, which boded very well. If we had 30 people out there yesterday, we could have done a hell of a lot. We could have had, and we had some mobility. We could have had the signs, the speakers, etc., given it some leadership. But politically, we were not able to solidify those young people, and they politically disintegrated. And I say that because they didn't just split with us, they did not continue in the struggle, which is even bigger thing. I'd have respect for people who work with us, we separate, go our ways, but we see them at the barricades and on the streets. And I think we have a problem also. We have to figure out how to mobilize. We have more members than just participating in these meetings, but they are not necessarily active. And to be a communist, you have to not just think the same revolutionary thoughts, you also have to take action. And so, you know, we have our work cut out for us. And the other thing is we're talking about building, you know, locally or maybe statewide. And, but nationally, it's a very bad situation that we do not have a national political organization or party, or even just a revolutionary front of some kind that can coordinate on a national level. And this is all a challenge for us to give thought to, and that's holding back, because otherwise you'll have huge uprisings and they'll dissipate and nothing will come of them. That'll happen over and over and over. That's all.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in many cases, you cannot predict when these rebellions, even strikes, and other forms of resistance will take place. For example, in Russia, it was not the Bolsheviks that organized the February Revolution, the uprising. I mean, Trotsky was in the United States, you know, when it happened, and Lenin was in exile. So, you know, it happened, but they were able to figure out how to intervene in the uprising and transform it into a genuine revolutionary movement. For example, if we were in Minneapolis or St. Paul a week ago today, and we're going out on Lake Avenue in front of the 3rd Precinct and said, let's have a rebellion. We're tired of all of this. All these corporations like Target, Cub Foods, AutoZone, they've been exploiting us for years. Let's take them out. Let's run the police out of the community. People have thought we were crazy. 3 days later, 4 days later, this is what's happening almost spontaneously. So it's an amazing situation. In Detroit in '67, they were saying that the people were working too hard. They were being paid too much money, and they did have a higher rate of income in Detroit, even African Americans than people in other cities. You had Black people working in factories. People had their own businesses, their own homes, and so forth. Even in '67, they said, no, it's not going to happen in Detroit. People have better housing. They have better job opportunities. You have 2 African-American Congress people, John Conyers and Charles Diggs Jr. They were both in the US Congress in 1967. unprecedented anywhere else in the United States. I don't believe that existed. But when the rebellion broke out here, it was larger and more violent and even more political than any of the other cities over the previous years. And what happened afterwards in terms of the efforts to organize in the plants, which bore fruit for many years, and organization in the community. I mean, there's a direct line between the rebellion in '67 and the election of Coleman Young in 6 years later, in 1973, the defeat of stress. So spontaneity can be very important, but what do we do after the spontaneous uprisings and outbreaks, or even strikes for that matter? I think that's our task, to grapple with those issues and work on those issues, because like I said, a week ago, if we had gone out a week ago downtown and say we need to get thousands of people to come out to protest through Detroit, even hundreds, people would have doubted us seriously. And then, of course, within a matter of a day or two, those numbers came out in Detroit yesterday. So all I'm saying is that a lot of times you can't predict these things. I mean, you can give a broad prediction. You know, we've been talking about the last 2.5 months that the situation socially is going to get really bad in the United States. You know, we've been talking about that. But the character of it, a lot of times you can't predict what may happen. We see all these strikes now developing, in the meat packing, people walking off the job and all these kind of things that are going on. But it's going to take a lot more to ensure the safety of working people in this country, which is in peril right now. I mean, look at the education system. We didn't get a chance to really get into it. They're talking about long distance learning. Even if they give students computers and install Wi-Fi networks, with people being out of work, with people being evicted, it's going to be a lot of overcrowding and there's going to be a lot of homelessness. So it's a profound crisis that exists for young people that is looming right now. And we don't know what the course of this virus is going to be. We really don't know at this point. I think people here in Detroit have done a great job, of sheltering and, social distancing, wearing masks and so forth. But with the pressure to reopen the economy, we don't know what's going to happen. I've been trying to follow this on a daily basis. We've seen spikes in other states that didn't have nearly the number of cases that we had here in Michigan. Now, places like Montgomery, Alabama, they say it's horrendous what's going on there. So we have to be concerned about all that. I just wanted to mention too that I wrote an article on Wednesday about the early phase of this struggle, and people can read it, but it's already outdated. Things have developed so fast. So I've been writing every day. So I was going to send in some of the other writings, and the editorial committee can look at it. Just yesterday, we had the intervention of the National Guard, the state police in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We've had so many other developments that have taken place around the country just in the last 2 days. So it's a major task just to try to keep track of what's going on.
Yeah, I saw Chris, you had your hand raised before.
Yeah, of course, I agree with all the comments. I just want to point out that before we take it as fact that this thing is going to peter out, we have to recognize certain things that are underlaying this uprising. We have a pandemic that has placed 100,000 people in the grave, that has placed more than 40 million people on the unemployment lines, much more than that actually, and has placed and has Wall Street trying to stampede the working class back to work in conditions that are that they're at the same time denying their own public health agencies any control over those conditions that they would go back to work in. So this uprising, yes, it may peter out, or it may be the first step in a gigantic tumultuous period of one uprising after another. Wall Street right now has got a gigantic bubble where it's placed its equity prices, its stock prices are entirely based on losses, and instead of earning, the price of the stocks over earnings are enormous, and this means that it's a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. And it's only being sustained because they want to keep Trump in office, and they want the people that have the 401ks and the IRAs to not turn on Trump or to turn on them. This is a compressed, that's Abiomi says, it's really a compressed period of history where we have so many things going on. And yes, we have tremendous obstacles. We're very small. We've had a lot of problems, and the left is very badly split. But I think the Congress who talked about developing a program or several programs to deal with this are on the right track. And I really want to endorse that, as well as doing what we can to get the message that revolutionary socialism is the only way. Scientific socialism is the only way. I noticed the fact that even the participants in all these rebellions yesterday in all these cities, most of them had masks on. Now, you could say, well, partly that inhibits the police doing identification, but I think it also recognizes the social consciousness among people, the young people there, that they, at the same time that they were mad as hell about these police killings, they were also conscious of being a social grouping, a grouping together, a class together, that wanted to protect each other at the same time as expressing their anger. And so I think it's a very productive thing and something that we should look forward to this period and not be discouraged at this in any way at this first step. I'm done.
Thank you. I actually have to jump off because I have to go into something else right now. But thank you very much. I'm sure things are wrapping up. I just have to hop out. But thanks a lot, Abiyumi and everybody else for all your contributions. I'll get onto the YouTube after this and just trim it up, and we'll have it as another video on our
I
channel.
think we should adjourn.
Yes.
Okay, everyone have a good weekend. What's left?
Yeah. Awesome. Great
Later,
talk.
everyone. Later.
Okay.
Great job. Great
Thank
job.
you. All right.